All right, welcome to chapter 6. More information on inventory. Woohoo! Um, but this time we're going to be looking at reporting various aspects of inventory, and then chapter 6 ends with some analysis. So you'll like that as well. But we start off with sort of a review of part of what you already learned in chapter 5 before we go into the big part of today's lesson, which is objective 2, and we're stopping there today. But this is going to be the very, very big part of the lesson today that you'll see. But first things first, learning objective 1 in chapter 6 basically reviews a lot of stuff you've already been introduced to in chapter 5. And so this is not going to be very difficult at all. Again, it goes over the fact that merchandising companies are a bit different than manufacturers. Manufacturers are the ones that actually are designing, creating and designing and making the products. So they actually have a lot to their inventory. And you're going to learn about all of this wonderful inventory systems in manufacturing, like raw materials and work in process and finished goods inventory, when you get to accounting 204, which is our managerial accounting class. There we go into a lot of detail on this. So stay tuned. But for this particular chapter, we're looking at a merchandising company, and they only have one basic inventory account. Okay, some call it merchandise inventory, or you can just simply call it inventory. But either way, we understand that inventory is important part of their business. Matter of fact, for most companies, inventory is their business. And so making sure they keep track of that inventory is very important because, of course, inventory costs money to either make or buy. And secondly, the reason you have the inventory is because you want to sell it because that's where your profits are. So keeping track of the inventory is extremely important. And so they have to literally take a physical inventory, regardless what system they use, perpetual or, of course, periodic is based on the physical inventory. They need to make sure their records are accurate. They need to make sure everything is as accurate as possible. Again, this is their core business. This is why they exist. So they have to do this well. And specifically, they have to make sure, particularly in a perpetual system where, basically it's computerized inventory, they want to make sure they're understanding how much inventory is being lost to waste or shoplifting or sadly employee theft. That happens a bit as much or more than shoplifting actually does. So they have to sort of understand that a physical inventory is helping them gather other types of information about that. Of course, a periodic system, that's how they do their financials, right? Inventory on hand, and that's how they determine their cost of goods sold. So physical inventory is extremely important, as you already know. Okay. When they actually do take a physical inventory, it's usually when the business is either closed or like right now, when for most retailers, Christmas shopping season is long gone. Well, it's been gone for a little while. And now it's time that things are slowing down. It's time to take inventory, time to literally take inventory. They also have to take a physical count of the inventory at the end of the accounting period because that annual statement really has to be as perfect as it can be. And so one of those things is making sure that the inventory is counted appropriately, the cost of goods sold is appropriate, et cetera, for their accounting period. We already talked about from chapter 5 when ownership of goods is determined, right? Because you have one business who owns the goods selling it to another business who bought the goods. So when does that legal title of the goods go from the seller to the buyer, right? And so that's why we learned about FOB shipping and FOB destination, is we wanted to know basically who owns it when. So that's a very, very important part. There are parts of inventory that are what we call goods in transit, that you can't physically count them because they're not there, right? They're in transit. You've shipped them or you're waiting for them to arrive. And so that has to be counted in the inventory as well if you have any goods that are in transit, because assumingly you own them. If you have legal title to them, they need to be in your inventory. So again, all that has to be tracked um, quite closely, whether the inventory is at shipping point. Again, at shipping point, right, the buyer owns it at shipping point, even though it's not physically where the buyer is. But guess it's part of the buyer's inventory. They have to count that as part of their inventory because they own it, even though it's in transit. For FOB destination, again, it's the seller who's boxing it up and putting it on a truck. And because the seller still owns it, right, even though it's not physically at the seller's at the seller's store or warehouse, they still have to count it as their inventory because it's still in transit. Okay. One thing that's very interesting is there are a lot of companies that actually have a lot of consigned goods. And that means that they have basically um, somewhat rented their shelf space to companies who stock their own inventory, and they basically get a percentage of the sale. So in your general supermarket, for example, you walk down um, that wonderful snack aisle with all those bags of chips and other things that are taste really good, but are not really great for you. Um, well, almost all of that is a consigned good. In other words, you'll see Frito-Lay or other companies actually doing all of the inventory there. It's not owned by the supermarket. It's a consigned good. Same thing when the Coke and Pepsi type of aisle, those are, it's somewhat rented space to some degree. Now the supermarket gets a share of the sale when customers buy it. That's how they get paid. But do they actually own the goods? No. Consigned goods are not owned by various things, various stores that actually have them for sale as part there, but it's not their inventory. So car dealers, boat dealers, antique dealers, among others, supermarkets included, sell goods on consignment. And thus, even though they are physically keeping the goods in their store, they can't count those goods as part of their inventory because they don't own them. They don't own them, right? It's about ownership. So that's an important piece here. And so your do it exercise for number one really emphasizes those rules of ownership. Okay. So here we have a company has been, maybe they're not in business anymore, right? Because they're has-beens. They've completed their inventory and they have totaled their inventory at $200,000. Okay. So then we have some other information that's very, very important, right? So that's the amount of inventory they have at their particular company site. They actually have physically counted their inventory, and that's the value. However, as you see here, they are holding $15,000 worth of inventory on consignment. So they don't own that. They have to take that $15,000 out of that $200,000 number because they don't own it. So they can't put it on their balance sheet as inventory, right? Here it looks like the company did not include that they had $10,000 of inventory that are in transit. Okay. Now it's FOB shipping, which means as soon as it got to the shipping company, they owned it. Now they're waiting for it to be physically delivered. So certainly if they're waiting for it to be physically delivered, they couldn't count it. right? So it's not part of this amount. So they have to add this in to that, right? So they're subtracting out the consignment goods. They're adding in the goods that are in transit because they own it. All right. Here, the company did not include inventory that had been sold, right, at a cost of $12,000, which was also in transit, FOB shipping. So if it's in transit, FOB shipping, they don't own that anymore. They don't own that anymore. And because they did not include it, that's a good thing. Because they don't own it. They shouldn't be including it. Okay. So, so nothing wrong with number three, but as you see, there were things wrong with 1 and 2. So I'm going to take a quick break, bring us back to our main screen, and ask if there's any questions on objective 1.